Before we begin tonight, you might take a moment to gently dim the lights around you. Let the room become a little softer, a little quieter. If you're lying down, allow your shoulders to sink naturally and let your breath slow without trying to control it. There's nothing you need to solve right now, nothing you need to hold on to. Just let the day drift a little further away with each quiet breath, and when you're ready, we can begin. Tonight, we travel back to a time before China was a single country, to an age when the land was divided and certainty was rare. In our world, rules feel familiar, roads connect everything, and systems quietly hold life together. But more than 2,000 years ago, none of that existed yet. Instead, there were many states, many rulers, and many different ways of living, all moving in different directions, often colliding. And somewhere within that fractured world, a single idea began to take shape. What if everything could be brought into one order, not just the land, but the people, their words, and even the way they lived each day? And as this idea slowly spread, it would begin to change everything. The road stretches across a dry plain, its surface uneven, marked by the passing of wheels and feet over many years. Along its edges, small villages sit quietly, their wooden walls worn by wind, their roofs darkened by smoke from countless evenings. There is no single language spoken here in exactly the same way. No single law that governs all who pass through, and no shared certainty about what tomorrow might bring. Over time, life has learned to adapt to this uncertainty. In one region, a farmer wakes before sunrise, stepping into the cold air to tend fields that may soon lie within another ruler's domain. In another, a family gathers in silence as distant sounds of marching drift across the hills, too far to see, but close enough to understand. The land is not empty, but it is divided. Each territory follows its own customs, its own measures, its own records. And when people travel from one place to another, they carry not only goods, but also the burden of difference. A coin accepted in one town may be refused in the next. A written word may not be understood beyond a certain distance, and a promise made under one authority may hold no meaning under another. As this continues, something subtle begins to change. The people do not always speak of it directly, but it is there, in the way conversations pause, in the way eyes turn toward the road, in the way silence lingers a little longer than before. There's a quiet sense that this world cannot remain as it is forever. In the years that follow, the rhythm of life becomes increasingly shaped by movement, by shifting borders, and by the constant presence of forces beyond any one person's control. Caravans move carefully, choosing routes not only for distance, but for safety. Messengers travel between courts, carrying decisions that may redraw entire regions. And in the distance, armies gather, not always in visible lines, but in preparation. For many, survival is no longer just about the seasons, but about understanding power. And gradually, the idea of order begins to feel less like a preference and more like a necessity. Some begin to wonder what it might mean to live in a world where the roads are the same everywhere, where measures do not change, where words carry the same meaning from one end of the land to the other. It is not yet a clear vision, but it is forming. Far to the west, beyond the lands that many consider central, there is a state that has been watching these changes closely. Its lands are harsher, its traditions, less tied to older customs, and its rulers, more willing to experiment with new ways of governing. Over time, this state begins to shape itself differently. Where others rely on tradition, it begins to rely on structure. Where others value lineage, it begins to value function. And where others hesitate, it moves forward, step by step, with a kind of quiet determination. At first, these changes seem small, a law written more clearly, a reward given more directly, a punishment enforced more consistently. But as these patterns repeat, they begin to create something else, a system. And within that system, people start to behave differently. Actions are measured, results are recorded, and over time, habits begin to shift. It does not happen all at once, but gradually, a different kind of society begins to take shape. One where uncertainty is reduced, but freedom may also begin to narrow. As this happens, the other states continue on their own paths, some adapting, some resisting, and some simply enduring. Yet beneath all of it, there is a slow movement, almost invisible at first. Like water finding its way through small openings, a single direction begins to emerge. And in the years that follow, that direction will become harder to ignore. Because the state in the West is no longer only changing itself, it is preparing to change everything. If you enjoy slow, immersive history like this, you can gently support the journey by subscribing to the channel. And if you're listening as you rest, you might leave a quiet comment and let me know where in the world you are tonight. Now, let the story continue. The road stretches quietly across the land. Its surface is uneven, pressed down by years of wheels, footsteps, and the slow passage of people who rarely stayed in one place for long. Along its edges, small settlements rest beneath low wooden roofs, their walls worn by wind, their gates half open, as if always prepared for someone to arrive or to leave. In one village, a man rises before dawn, stepping outside into air that still carries the chill of night. He pauses for a moment, listening, not for anything in particular, but out of habit. Over time, people have learned to listen, not just to the wind or the animals, but to the distant sounds that travel across the land. A faint rhythm, sometimes steady, sometimes uneven, the sound of movement. Far away, beyond the low hills, something is always shifting. Armies do not always appear as lines of soldiers. Sometimes they exist only as rumors, carried from one place to another, changing slightly each time they are told. And yet, the effect is the same. People wait, they watch, and they adjust. In the years that follow, life becomes shaped by this quiet uncertainty. A farmer tends his field, knowing that the land he works today may belong to a different ruler tomorrow. A trader wraps his goods carefully, not only to protect them from travel, but to prepare for the moment when they may no longer be accepted beyond a certain boundary. Because in this world, boundaries are everywhere. Not always marked clearly, not always guarded, but always present. A coin used in one region may be refused in the next. A written message, carefully recorded on bamboo, may become meaningless beyond a certain distance, simply because the symbols change. Even time feels slightly different from place to place. Festivals do not align, customs do not match, and what is considered proper in one village may seem unfamiliar in another. As this continues, a quiet tension begins to build. Not loud, not immediate, but steady. people begin to notice small things. The hesitation before accepting a stranger's words, the pause before agreeing to a trade, the way conversations often circle without reaching certainty. It is not chaos in the way of constant noise or visible destruction. It is something slower, a world that does not quite fit together. And gradually, without being spoken aloud, a question begins to form. What would it be like if everything followed the same pattern? If a road did not change meaning as it crossed a border? If a word carried the same weight no matter who read it? If a command, once given, could reach every corner of the land without losing its shape? For now, these thoughts remain distant, because the world continues as it always has. Messengers move carefully between courts, carrying decisions that may alter alliances overnight. Small groups of soldiers pass along the horizon, their presence enough to shift the mood of an entire village. Families gather at night, speaking in lowered voices, not out of fear alone, but out of habit formed over many years. And yet, beneath all of this, something is changing. Far to the west, beyond the regions that many consider central, there is a state that feels different. Its land is harder, its seasons less forgiving, and its people have adapted in their own way. Over time, they begin to rely less on tradition and more on structure, less on memory and more on record, less on inherited status and more on measurable action. At first, these differences are subtle. A rule enforced more consistently, a reward given more directly, a punishment applied without hesitation. But as this happens again and again, a pattern begins to emerge. And when a pattern repeats long enough, it becomes something else, a system. Within that system, people begin to change. Not all at once, and not in the same way, but gradually. Actions become more deliberate, choices more calculated, and behavior more predictable. For some, this brings a sense of stability. For others, something less easy to name. Because as uncertainty begins to fade, another feeling takes its place, a quiet awareness that life is becoming easier to understand, and at the same time, harder to step outside of. As this continues, the other states move forward in their own ways. Some hold tightly to old customs, others attempt small reforms, and many simply endure, waiting to see what will come next. But beneath all of it, there's a slow movement, not driven by a single moment, but by countless small changes, aligning over time. Like water finding its path through the land, a direction begins to form. And in the years that follow, that direction will become impossible to ignore. Because the state in the West is no longer only shaping itself, it is preparing to shape the world around it. And as this happens, something larger begins to take form. As this quiet uncertainty continued, life did not stop. It adjusted. In the early light of morning, a small market begins to take shape beside a narrow road. Wooden stalls are set up slowly, cloth unrolled, baskets placed down with care. A woman arranges grains into small measured piles, not by a standard shared across the land, but by what her customers have come to recognize. Nearby, a trader checks the weight of a bronze piece in his hand, turning it slightly, as if the metal itself might reveal whether it will be accepted or refused in the next town. Over time, these small acts become second nature. People learn not to expect consistency, but to adapt to difference. A young boy watches his father negotiate with a stranger, listening closely, not just to the words, but to the pauses between them. Because meaning is not always certain. A term used in one region may carry a slightly different tone in another. A gesture, harmless in one place, may be taken differently elsewhere. And so, understanding becomes something that must be built each time from the beginning. As this happens, travel itself becomes a careful act. Caravans do not move freely, they move thoughtfully. Routes are chosen not only for distance, but for safety, for familiarity, for the likelihood that agreements will be honored, at least long enough to pass through. At the edge of one settlement, a guard leans against a wooden post, watching those who enter and those who leave. He does not ask many questions, but his presence is enough to remind travelers that they are crossing into another authority, another set of expectations, and once inside, everything shifts just slightly. The language feels familiar, but not identical. The rules are known, but not guaranteed. Over time, this creates a quiet tension that settles into everyday life. A farmer working his field pauses when he sees dust rising in the distance, not immediately afraid, but aware, because movement often brings change. In the years that follow, news spreads in fragments. There is no single source, no unified account, only voices carrying pieces of information, each shaped by the journey it has taken. A battle fought far away becomes a story told in a courtyard, retold at a roadside, and remembered differently by the time it reaches another village. And yet, even without certainty, the effect is real. People adjust their plans, delay decisions, or act sooner than they might have otherwise. Because in a divided world, waiting can be as dangerous as acting too quickly. As this continues, rulers begin to see the same pattern from a different perspective. They observe not just land or armies, but behavior. How people respond to fear, how they react to reward, how quickly they adapt when conditions change. In one state, a decree is issued, promising grain to those who produce more than expected. In another, punishment is increased for those who fail to meet demands. These approaches vary, but they share a common intention: control, not only of territory, but of outcomes. And gradually, some states begin to move further in this direction than others. They experiment, they record, they compare results. At first, the changes are small. A clearer law, a stricter enforcement, a more direct reward. But over time, patterns begin to emerge. In certain regions, behavior becomes more predictable. Production increases, response times shorten, and with that comes something else: efficiency. For those who live under these conditions, life begins to feel slightly different. More structured, more defined, but also less flexible. A man who once relied on personal relationships now finds himself measured by output. A family that once negotiated its own arrangements now follows rules set beyond its control. The change is not sudden, but it is steady. And because it is steady, it becomes harder to notice until it has already taken hold. As this happens, other states continue in their own ways, some slower to change, some unwilling, some unable. And the differences between them begin to widen. In one place, life remains shaped by custom, in another, by command. In one region, decisions are negotiated. In another, they are enforced. Over time, these contrasts become more visible. Travelers begin to speak of certain states as more stable, more reliable, not necessarily more kind, but more predictable. And in a world filled with uncertainty, predictability carries its own kind of value. As the years pass, this value becomes clearer. People begin to gravitate, not toward comfort, but toward consistency. And rulers begin to understand that control is not only about force, it is about shaping expectation. In the distance, beyond the familiar roads and shifting borders, there is one state where these ideas are being taken further, not as an experiment, but as a foundation. And as this continues, a different kind of order begins to take root. Over time, the world does not collapse all at once. It wears down, not through a single moment of destruction, but through repetition, small uncertainties, returning again and again. In one village, a man sits beside a wooden table, turning a piece of grain between his fingers, calculating quietly, not only how much he has, but how much he might lose, depending on what happens next. Because in a divided land, the future is never only about effort, it is about conditions. The rain may come, the harvest may grow, and still, everything can change. A new order may arrive, a different authority may take control, and the value of what was just earned may shift overnight. As this happens, people begin to adjust their expectations, not upward, but inward. They prepare, not for success, but for survival. A trader closes his stall earlier than before, not because business is finished, but because uncertainty has grown. A family stores more than they need, not out of abundance, but out of caution. And gradually, life becomes narrower, not visibly, but quietly. In the years that follow, this pattern spreads. Fields are still planted, roads are still traveled, markets still form each morning. But beneath these routines, there is a steady awareness that nothing is fully stable. And over time, this awareness begins to shape thought itself. People speak less in certainty and more in possibility. If things remain as they are, if no one comes, if the road stays open, each sentence carries a condition. And as this continues, something begins to change in how the world is understood. Not as a place of fixed order, but as a shifting landscape, where meaning depends on circumstance. At first, this flexibility allows people to endure. They become adaptable, resourceful, able to move between different systems without losing themselves completely. But as the years pass, this same flexibility begins to carry a cost, because when everything can change, nothing can be relied upon. A promise holds only as long as the conditions around it remain intact. A rule applies only within a certain boundary. A decision must always be reconsidered. And gradually, the effort required to navigate this world increases. Not physically, but mentally. Every choice becomes layered. Every action requires consideration, not only of what is happening now, but of what might change next. As this happens, a quiet fatigue begins to settle in. Not the fatigue of labor, but the fatigue of constant adjustment, a kind of weariness that does not show easily, but remains beneath the surface. In one household, a father explains to his son why a decision made last season can no longer be followed. The boy listens, not confused, but already familiar with the idea that things do not last. And in that moment, something becomes clear. This is not a world that hold still. It is a world that requires constant recalculation. As more people begin to feel this, a different kind of desire slowly takes shape. Not for wealth, not for power, but for something simpler. Consistency. The idea that a measure might remain the same, that a word might not change its meaning across distance, that a rule might apply regardless of where one stands. At first, this desire is not spoken directly. It appears, instead, in small preferences. A trader choosing a route where agreements are more predictable. A farmer favoring a region where authority changes less often. A traveler remembering which places feel more stable. And as these choices accumulate, they begin to form a pattern. People move toward reliability, even if it comes with greater restriction. Because over time, restriction begins to feel different from chaos. Restriction can be understood, it can be anticipated, it can be worked within. Chaos cannot. As this realization spreads, rulers begin to notice. They observe not only conflict, but the underlying strain that drives it. And some begin to ask, not how to win the next battle, but how to end the need for so many battles altogether. This question does not yet have a clear answer, but in certain places, it leads to new ideas. Ideas about structure, about law, about shaping behavior in ways that reduce uncertainty, even if they reduce freedom as well. And far to the west, in a land often considered distant from the cultural center, these ideas are not only being considered, they are being applied. Carefully, consistently, and without hesitation. As this happens, a different kind of strength begins to emerge. Not just the strength of armies, but the strength of a system that does not bend easily. And in the years that follow, this difference will begin to matter more than anything else. As these patterns spread across the land, not every state responded in the same way. Some held on to what they had always known. Traditions passed down, rituals repeated, ways of living that felt familiar, even when the world around them was changing. But far to the west, there was a place where the response was different. The land itself felt harsher. The air carried more dust, the soil less forgiving. And the distance from what many considered the cultural center created a quiet separation. Over time, this distance began to matter, because while other regions looked backward, this one began to look forward. In a settlement near the edge of cultivated land, a group of workers moves in silence, lifting tools, setting them down, repeating the same motions without distraction. There is less conversation, less negotiation, more instruction. A man stands nearby, holding a narrow strip of bamboo, recording what he sees. Not impressions, not opinions, but numbers. How much was done, how long it took, who completed the task. At first, this feels unusual, because in many places, work is shaped by relationship, by familiarity, by understanding between people. But here, something else is beginning to take form. A different way of seeing, where action matters more than intention, and result more than explanation. As this continues, rules begin to appear more clearly, more frequently, and once written, they do not shift easily. A mistake is followed by consequence, an achievement by reward. And over time, this consistency creates something rare. Predictability. In a small administrative hall, a local official reads from a document, his voice steady, without emphasis. The people gathered do not interrupt. They listen, and they remember. Because here, forgetting is not a simple matter. Records are kept, names are written, outcomes are tracked, and gradually, memory begins to move away from individuals and into the system itself. As this happens, behavior changes, not suddenly, but steadily. A worker who once relied on effort alone now considers outcome before beginning. A family that once made decisions internally now weighs them against external rules. Over time, this creates a subtle shift. Life becomes less uncertain, but also less open. In another part of the state, a young man stands before an official, awaiting judgment. His actions are not debated, his intentions are not discussed, only the result matters. The decision is delivered quickly, and as he steps away, there is no argument, no appeal, only acceptance. Because within this system, the law does not bend to accommodate feeling. It remains constant, clear, and at times unforgiving. As this structure strengthens, those who live within it begin to understand something important. That survival no longer depends only on adaptation, but on alignment. To move against the system is to invite consequence. To move with it is to gain stability. And in a world where stability is rare, this becomes a powerful incentive. In the years that follow, the state begins to stand apart. Not because it is more peaceful or more generous, but because it is more controlled, more ordered, more consistent. Travelers passing through notice the difference. Even if they cannot fully describe it, the roads feel more direct, the exchanges more certain, the outcomes more predictable. And with that comes a quiet realization that this place operates differently, that it has found a way not to remove uncertainty entirely, but to reduce it more than others have managed. As this becomes clearer, its influence begins to grow. Not through words, but through results. Other states observe, some with interest, some with concern, because what is forming here is not just another variation of governance. It is something more complete. A structure that does not rely on tradition alone or on personal authority, but on rules, applied without hesitation. And as this system continues to develop, it begins to do more than organize its own people. It begins to prepare, quietly, deliberately, for a future where this kind of order will no longer remain contained within its own borders. As this structure continued to take shape, it did not emerge on its own. It was built, carefully, deliberately, and with a clarity that set it apart from everything around it. In a quiet administrative courtyard, a man unrolls a strip of bamboo, the surface marked with lines of text, written with precision, without decoration. Around him, a small group listens, not as observers, but as participants in something that is still being formed. This is not a story being told, but a system being defined. Over time, the name associated with these changes becomes known, Shang, not as a ruler, but as an architect, someone who did not inherit power, but reshaped how power could function. At first, the changes he introduces seem simple. A law written clearly, a punishment applied consistently, a reward given without delay. But as these elements repeat, they begin to alter something deeper. Because for the first time, rules are no longer suggestions. They are expectations. In a village not far from the administrative center, a notice is placed at the entrance. its contents read aloud to those who gather nearby. It explains what is required, what is forbidden, and what will follow either choice. There is no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. And gradually, people begin to understand that this clarity is not temporary, it is the system itself. As this happens, another change begins to unfold. Responsibility is no longer individual, it becomes shared. Families are grouped together, their actions linked, their outcomes connected. If one person fails, others may be affected. If one succeeds, the benefit may extend beyond the individual. At first, this creates tension. Neighbors begin to watch one another more closely. Conversations shift, becoming more careful, more measured. Because in this structure, trust is no longer based only on familiarity. It is tied to consequence. Over time, this produces a different kind of order, not one built on mutual understanding, but one maintained through awareness. A quiet vigilance that settles into daily life. In the fields, work becomes more consistent. Not because conditions have improved, but because expectations are clearer. In the homes, decisions are made with greater caution. Not because people have changed suddenly, but because the system now reaches further than before, and gradually, the effects begin to accumulate. Production increases. Response becomes faster. Deviation becomes rare. From a distance, this appears effective. A state that functions, that responds, that maintains control. But within it, the experience is more complex. A man who once relied on his own judgment now measures his actions against written rules. A family that once negotiated its own balance now aligns itself with external structure. Nothing is left entirely undefined, and in that, there is both strength and pressure. As this continues, Shang introduces something else. A new way of valuing people, not by lineage, not by status at birth, but by contribution. In the military, rank is earned through measurable achievement. In administration, position follows performance. At first, this seems to open opportunity. A path that did not exist before now becomes possible. But over time, it also reinforces the system, because success becomes tied to compliance. To move upward, one must function within the rules, not outside them. And so, ambition itself begins to align with structure. In a training ground near the edge of the state, a group of soldiers stands in formation, their movements synchronized, their focus fixed ahead. They do not act as individuals, but as parts of a whole. Each motion measured, each response expected, and as this repeats day after day, the distinction between personal choice and assigned role begins to blur. This is not enforced through constant force, but through repetition, through clarity, through the steady application of rules that do not change. As the years pass, the system grows stronger, not louder, not more visible, but more complete. It extends into administration, into agriculture, into military organization, and gradually, it shapes the state itself. Those who live within it begin to move differently, think differently, decide differently, not because they are told to change, but because the structure around them leaves little space not to. And in this, something important becomes clear. This is no longer simply a set of laws. It is a way of organizing life, one that reduces uncertainty, but also reduces deviation, one that creates stability, but requires alignment. As other states continue to struggle with inconsistency, with negotiation, with shifting expectations, this system offers something else. A model, not perfect, not without cost, but effective. And in a world that has grown tired of unpredictability, effectiveness begins to matter more than anything else. As this realization spreads, what began as a set of reforms starts to take on a different role. It becomes, a foundation. And in the years that follow, this foundation will support something far larger than it was ever originally intended to hold. As this system continued to grow, it did more than organize behavior. It began to reshape how people were understood, not in words at first, but in practice. In a quiet chamber lined with bamboo records, a man studies a series of reports, his eyes moving steadily from one line to the next, not searching for stories, but for patterns. How many completed their work? How many failed? How many improved? After correction, there's no mention of intention, no discussion of character, only outcome. And over time, this way of observing begins to take hold. Because when actions are recorded and results are compared, a certain conclusion becomes easier to accept. That people are predictable, not always in what they want, but in how they respond, to reward, to punishment, to expectation. As this idea spreads, it forms the foundation of something deeper, a belief not loudly declared, but quietly applied. That human behavior can be shaped, not through persuasion alone, but through structure. In a training yard, a group of young men repeats the same movement again and again, their steps measured, their timing aligned. At first, the motion feels unnatural, their bodies resisting the pattern. But with repetition, something changes. The movement becomes easier, then automatic, and eventually it requires no thought at all. As this happens, the lesson extends beyond the exercise, because if a body can be trained, then perhaps behavior can be guided in the same way. Over time, this belief begins to influence decision-making at every level. Policies are not designed to inspire, but to produce results. Rules are not written to reflect ideals, but to create outcomes. And gradually, the space between what people choose and what they are guided to do becomes smaller. In a household near the edge of cultivated land, a father speaks to his son, not about what is right, but about what is expected. He explains the consequences of failing to meet certain standards, the rewards of exceeding them. And the boy listens, not with resistance, but with understanding, because this is the language of the world he is growing into, a world where behavior is measured, and measured behavior is remembered. As this continues, another shift begins to take place. Judgment becomes less personal. An action is not good or bad because of who performed it, but because of what it produces. A mistake is corrected, not out of anger, but as part of a process. A success is rewarded, not out of admiration, but to reinforce a pattern. And in this, something subtle begins to disappear, the need to interpret. Because when rules are clear and outcomes are defined, there is less room for uncertainty. For some, this brings relief, a sense that life no longer depends on unpredictable decisions or shifting expectations. But for others, something else is felt, a quiet narrowing. Because when every action is guided, there are fewer moments that belong entirely to the individual. In an administrative hall, a decision is recorded, not with commentary, but with finality. The process is efficient, the outcome clear, and as the next case is brought forward, the pattern repeats. No deviation, no delay. Over time, this consistency becomes the defining strength of the system. It does not hesitate. It does not question itself. It continues, and those who live within it begin to move in the same way. Their choices become aligned, their actions more predictable, not because they have lost the ability to think, but because the cost of deviation has been made clear. In the fields, work follows a rhythm that rarely changes. In the homes, decisions follow patterns that are understood before they are spoken. And across the state, a quiet transformation takes place. People begin to see themselves not only as individuals, but as parts of a larger structure, contributors to a system that measures, records, and responds. As this awareness deepens, another realization follows, that within this structure, freedom is not entirely absent, but it is defined differently. It exists within boundaries, within expectations, within outcomes that have already been shaped in advance. And gradually, this becomes normal. Not questioned, not resisted, simply accepted as the way things are. As this continues, the system reaches a new level of stability. Not because it removes all uncertainty, but because it reduces it enough to function. And in a world where uncertainty has long defined life, this reduction becomes power. A power not only over land or resources, but over behavior itself. And in the years that follow, this way of seeing people, not as they wish to be, but as they can be guided, will shape decisions that extend far beyond the boundaries of this single state. Because once behavior can be understood and shaped, it can also be directed. And when it can be directed, it can be unified. As this system settled into place, it created something that had not existed before, a structure strong enough to hold ambition. In the capital, behind high walls and long corridors of dark wood, a young figure moves quietly through spaces shaped by authority. He does not yet command armies. He does not yet give orders that reach across the land. But he is already inside the system, Ying Zheng. At first, there is little to distinguish him from others of his rank, his presence observed, but not yet defined. Around him, decisions are made by those who came before, voices older, more established, guiding the direction of the state. And like everything else in Qin, this too follows a pattern. Power is not taken suddenly. It is approached step by step. In the years that follow, Ying Jing watches. He listens. He learns not only what is said, but how it is said, and when silence is chosen instead. Because within this system, timing matters. A decision made too early can be corrected. A decision made too late may never be reversed. And gradually, his role begins to change. Not through a single moment, but through accumulation. Responsibility increases, expectations shift, and those around him begin to recognize that he is no longer only observing, he is beginning to act. In a chamber where maps are laid out across a wide table, lines drawn carefully to represent borders, he studies the land beyond Qin, not as a collection of distant territories, but as something connected. Each state with its own system, its own strengths, its own weaknesses. Some rely on tradition, others on negotiation, many on balance between competing forces. But from this perspective, they appear fragmented, separate. And in that separation, there is opportunity. As this realization takes shape, it does not come as a sudden vision, but as a steady understanding that what exists beyond Qin is not only different, it is incomplete. In the training grounds, soldiers move in formation, their steps aligned, their movements controlled. This is not unique. Other states train their armies as well. But here, something feels more consistent, less variation, less hesitation. And over time, this consistency becomes an advantage. Not immediately visible, but increasingly significant. In council, discussions unfold without raised voices, decisions emerging through a process that favors clarity over debate. Zheng listens, and when he speaks, it is measured. Not to persuade emotionally, but to align with what the system already supports. Because within Qin, the strongest argument is not the most passionate, it is the most consistent with structure. As the years pass, the position he holds becomes more defined, no longer shaped entirely by those around him, but by his own direction. And with that, the scale of thinking begins to change. No longer limited to internal order, but extending outward, toward the states that remain, toward the divisions that persist, toward a world that still does not fit together. In the distance, beyond the controlled roads and measured fields of Qin, life continues in its varied forms. Different systems, different expectations, different outcomes. And from within Qin, this difference becomes more than observation. It becomes a question. Why must it remain this way? Why must the land continue in fragments when a system now exists that can create consistency? At first, this question does not demand action. It exists quietly, beneath other priorities, beneath immediate concerns. But as time passes, it returns, again and again, growing clearer each time, until eventually it no longer remains a question. It becomes direction, in a long corridor lined with guards. Zheng walks forward, his pace steady, his expression unchanged. There is no announcement, no visible shift, and yet something has begun. Because the system that once shaped him is now something he will begin to extend. Not only to maintain order, but to expand it beyond Qin, across the land. And as this movement begins, it does not rush. It advances with the same precision, the same patience that built the system itself. But this time, the scale will be different. And in the years that follow, the world beyond Qin will begin to feel that difference. As this direction became clearer, movement began, not as a sudden surge, but as a series of decisions placed carefully over time. In the outer regions of Qin, supply lines extend quietly across the land, carts moving at a steady pace, carrying grain, tools, and materials, rather than noise. There is no urgency in their motion, only consistency. Because before anything else can change, the system must reach further. In a fortified outpost near the border, a commander studies a map etched onto a flat wooden board, his hand resting lightly along the lines that separate one state from another. These lines, though visible, are not permanent. They shift, they bend, they disappear, depending on who holds them. And for the first time, someone is looking at them, not as boundaries to defend, but as boundaries to remove. Over time, the first movements begin, not large enough to draw immediate attention, not forceful enough to create alarm, but deliberate. A territory changes hands, A position is secured, a route is controlled. From a distance, these events seem separate, unrelated, but within the system, they are part of a sequence. In a village just beyond Qin's influence, a group of travelers arrives, their clothing unfamiliar, their speech slightly different. They bring news, but not in the form of a single story, only fragments. A region to the north has shifted. A city has fallen, not in chaos, but with a kind of quiet finality. Life continues, but under a different authority. At first, the difference feels small. The markets open as before. The fields are still worked. The roads remain in place, but gradually changes appear. Rules become clearer, expectations more defined, responses more immediate. And for those who observe closely, a pattern begins to emerge. Where Qin moves, uncertainty decreases. Not entirely, but enough to be noticed. In the years that follow, this pattern repeats. One state, then another, each approached not only with force, but with structure. Armies advance, but they are supported by something deeper, a system that can hold what it takes. In a command tent set along a distant ridge, orders are written and dispatched without delay, their wording precise, their intent clear. There is no room for variation, no space for misinterpretation, because the strength of this movement is not only in what it does, but in how consistently it does it. Across the land, resistance appears, as it always has. For generations, states have defended themselves, have adapted, have endured. But this time, something feels different. Not louder, not more aggressive, but more complete. Where others rely on moments of strength, Qin relies on continuity, a steady pressure that does not break, that does not pause. That simply continues. In one city, gates remain closed longer than usual. Guards watch from above, their movements slower, more deliberate. Inside, the people wait, not in panic, but in uncertainty, because they have heard enough to understand that when Qin arrives, things do not return to what they were before. They become something else. As this awareness spreads, some choose to resist, others to submit, and many simply adapt. Because over time, adaptation has always been the way to survive. But this time, adaptation leads in one direction, toward a single system. In the distance, columns move along narrow paths, their formation consistent, their pace unbroken. They do not rush, they do not stop. And wherever they go, they bring not only change, but replacement. One structure exchanged for another. One set of expectations replaced by something more defined. And as this continues, the number of independent states begins to shrink. Not suddenly, but steadily, until what once felt like a vast and varied landscape begins to narrow. Fewer borders, fewer differences, more alignment, more sameness. And with each step, the idea that once seemed distant begins to take shape. Not as a question, but as a reality forming in real time, that the land, with all its variation, its history, its divisions, can be brought together, not through agreement, but through continuation. And as this process moves forward, one thing becomes increasingly clear. This is not a conquest driven by momentary force. It is a transformation, driven by a system that does not stop. And in the years that follow, there will be fewer places left untouched by it. As this steady movement continued, the number of remaining states grew smaller, not suddenly, but in a way that became harder to ignore with each passing year. Across the land, names that once carried weight began to fade. Han, Zhao, Wei, Chu, Yan, Qi. Each had its own history, its own rulers, its own way of organizing life. And for generations, they had existed side by side, sometimes in conflict, sometimes in uneasy balance, but over time, that balance could no longer hold. In a fortified city to the east, a gate stands closed, its wooden beams reinforced, its guards silent as they watch the horizon. Inside, life continues in a measured rhythm. Markets open, families gather. Officials record daily matters as they always have. And yet, beneath the surface, there is a growing awareness that what is approaching is not like what came before. Because in earlier time, when one state fell, another would take its place. The structure remained, the pattern continued. But now, the pattern itself is beginning to disappear. In the years that follow, each remaining state faces the same reality, not all at once, and not in the same way, but inevitably. Some resist, their defenses holding for a time, their leaders determined to preserve what has always existed. Others attempt to negotiate, to delay, to find a way to remain within the changing world. And some, seeing the direction clearly, choose to yield, not out of weakness alone, but out of recognition that the system moving toward them is not temporary. It does not depend on a single moment or a single victory. It continues. In a command center within Qin, reports arrive in sequence. Each one marked, each one recorded, each one added to a growing understanding. A region secured, a resistance ended, a transition completed. There is no celebration, no interruption of process, only continuation. Because the objective is not a single triumph, but completion. And gradually, that completion draws closer. One by one, the remaining states are absorbed, their systems replaced, their differences reduced. Not erased entirely, but brought into alignment. In the north, Yan falls. In the south, Chu is overcome after prolonged resistance. To the east, Qi, the last to remain, stands alone for a brief moment, before it too is drawn into the same direction. And then, there are no more states left to absorb, no more separate authorities, no more shifting alliances, only one structure extending across the land. In the year 221 before the Common Era, this process reaches its conclusion. Not as a sudden event, but as the final step in a long sequence. And in that moment, something changes, not only in governance, but in how the land itself is understood. Because for the first time, there is no longer a collection of states. There is one. In the capital, preparations take place without urgency, yet with clear intention. Titles are reconsidered. Language is adjusted. Symbols are chosen carefully. Because the position that now exists has no exact precedent. A ruler over all the land, not as one among equals, but as something else entirely. And so, a new title is formed. Huangdi, often translated later as emperor, but at this moment it represents something more specific. A claim that authority is no longer shared, that the structure of rule has changed from many centers to one. Ying Zheng now takes this title, not simply as recognition of victory, but as definition of a new order. From this point forward, he is no longer only the ruler of Qin. He becomes Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. As this declaration settles across the land, its meaning is not immediately felt in every place. In distant regions, life continues. Fields are tended, roads are traveled, voices speak as they always have. But gradually, the implications begin to reach further. Because this unification is not only about territory, it is about structure, a single system applied across a vast and previously divided world. And as this system begins to extend, the next phase does not begin with conquest, but with something quieter, the need to make everything function as one. And in the years that follow, this task will prove to be just as demanding as the unification itself. As the land settled into a single structure, a different kind of question began to take shape. Not about how to conquer, but about how to define what had been created. In the capital, preparations unfold without noise, courtyards swept clean, documents arranged in careful order, officials moving with measured purpose along long corridors of dark wood. There is no sense of urgency, only precision, because what is being formed is not a response to a moment. It is an attempt to give that moment a lasting shape. In a chamber set apart from the main hall, a group of advisors stands before a low table, scrolls unrolled, their contents examined and reconsidered. Titles are discussed, not casually, not as a matter of preference, but as something that must reflect a change that has never fully existed before. For generations, rulers have called themselves kings. Wang, a title shared across different states, implying authority, but within a system of many. Now, that system is gone. There are no longer multiple kings, no longer separate centers of power. And so, the old title no longer fits. It describes a world that no longer exists. As this becomes clear, a new idea is proposed. Not entirely new, but drawn from older concepts, rearranged, combined, given a different meaning. Huang, a word once associated with legendary beings, figures said to exist at the edge of history or beyond it. Dai, a term used for ancient sovereigns, rulers remembered more through story than record. Separately, these words carry distance, a sense of something beyond the ordinary. Together, they form something else. Huangdi, not simply a king, but something above the pattern that came before. As this title takes shape, it is not introduced with celebration, but with quiet acceptance. Because within the system that has been built, change does not need to be declared loudly. It only needs to be applied. Ying now stands at the center of that application. No longer one ruler among many, but the single point from which authority extends. And with that, his role changes, not only in scale, but in nature. In the main hall, rows of officials stand in stillness, their presence forming a quiet structure around the space. There is no movement beyond what is necessary, no sound beyond what is required, because this is no longer a place of negotiation. It is a place of confirmation. Orders do not emerge from debate. They move outward from a single source, and over time, this becomes the defining feature of the new order. Unity, not only of land, but of direction. In the days that follow, the title begins to move beyond the capital, carried along the same roads that once transported grain and command. It reaches the distant regions, the former borders, the places where difference once defined life. At first, it is only a word, a new term, heard, repeated, understood in part, but not entirely, but gradually, its meaning becomes clearer, because it is not only spoken, it is enacted. Where there were once multiple authorities, there is now one. Where decisions once depended on location, they now follow a single line. And as this continues, the idea of the emperor becomes less abstract, it becomes present. In the documents that arrive, in the rules that are applied, in the structure that does not change from place to place. In a village far from the capital, a local official reads aloud a decree, his voice steady, the words unfamiliar, yet firm. The people listen, not with resistance, but with attention. Because even without fully understanding, they recognize the pattern. This is not a temporary authority. It does not shift. It does not negotiate. It remains. As this awareness spreads, the scale of the transformation begins to settle into daily life. The land is no longer experienced as divided. Even if distance remains, even if difference persists, there is now a sense that everything belongs to the same structure. For some, this brings clarity, a reduction in uncertainty, a sense that the world has become easier to read. For others, something else is felt, a quiet realization that there is no longer an outside, no alternative system to move toward, no separate authority to appeal to, only one. As this becomes understood, the role of the emperor deepens, not only as a ruler, but as the defining center of the system itself. His decisions do not exist alongside others. They replace them. His authority does not compete. It extends. And over time, this creates a different kind of presence, one that is not always visible, but always implied, in the roads that connect distant regions, in the records that track behavior, in the laws that apply without variation. The emperor is there, not as a figure moving through space, but as a structure that surrounds it. As this continues, the initial phase of unification reaches its end. The land has been brought together, the title has been defined, and the center has been established. But what now begins is something more demanding, because creating a single structure is not the same as maintaining it. And in the years that follow, the system built to unify the land will begin to reach further, into language, into thought, and into the smallest details of daily life. As the title settled into place, and the structure of rule became clear, a deeper intention began to emerge. Not only to govern the land, but to shape it completely. In the capital, behind layers of walls and guarded gates, a different kind of work continues. Not the movement of armies, nor the securing of territory, but the ordering of everything that remains. In a long hall lined with records, officials sit at low tables, their hands moving steadily across strips of bamboo, copying, comparing, aligning. The work is quiet, but continuous, because now that the land has been unified, difference itself becomes a problem. Not the kind that leads to conflict, but the kind that creates inconsistency. A measure that changes from one place to another, a symbol that carries different meanings, a rule that applies unevenly. All of these create friction, and within a system built on clarity, friction cannot remain. Over time, this leads to a shift in thinking. Not just how to control people, but how to remove variation. In a workshop near the administrative quarter, a craftsman adjusts the edge of a measuring tool, checking its length against a standard kept nearby. The difference is small, almost invisible, but it matters. Because if one measure is allowed to vary, others will follow. And once variation spreads, certainty begins to weaken. As this understanding deepens, standardization begins to take form. Gradually, carefully, but with intention, units of weight are aligned, lengths are defined, forms are fixed. At first, these changes seem technical, limited to those who use them directly, but over time, their effects spread. A trader no longer needs to adjust his style at every boundary. A builder works with tools that match those used elsewhere. A record written in one place can be understood in another, and with this, a new kind of connection appears, not based on familiarity, but on uniformity. As this continues, another layer begins to shift. Language. In a chamber filled with documents, a scholar examines different forms of written characters, placing them side by side, noting their differences, their similarities, their inconsistencies. Because across the land, writing exists, but not in a single form. Symbols vary, meanings shift slightly. Understanding depends on region, and within a unified system, this cannot remain. Over time, a decision is made to define a standard, not to eliminate writing, but to align it, so that a message sent from the capital arrives unchanged in meaning, no matter how far it travels. As this process unfolds, scribes begin to copy new forms. Official documents adopt a consistent structure, and gradually, variation begins to fade. For those who rely on writing, this brings clarity, but it also brings something else, a narrowing. Because when one form becomes official, others lose their place. They are not always erased, but they are no longer central, and over time, they become less visible. In the streets, in the markets, in the homes, these changes are not always noticed immediately. Life continues, but slowly. Patterns align. A coin looks the same in every hand. A measure holds the same value in every exchange. A word carries the same meaning across distance. And with this alignment, a new experience begins to form. The sense that the world is becoming easier to navigate, more predictable, more consistent. And yet, as this consistency grows, something else becomes clear. That this is not happening on its own. It is being shaped, deliberately, from the center outward. In the imperial court, decisions are not made in isolation. They are connected, each one reinforcing the next. A standard leads to another. A correction leads to alignment. A difference leads to adjustment. Until gradually, the system extends into every aspect of life. Not forcefully, but persistently. In the fields, farmers use tools that match those used elsewhere. In the workshops, craftsmen follow forms that are recognized beyond their region. In the records, officials write in a script that no longer changes from place to place. And in all of this, the presence of the emperor remains. Not always visible, but always underlying. Because this movement toward total order does not come from many directions. It comes from one. As the years pass, this effort continues. Not because it is complete, but because completion itself is part of the intention. A world where everything fits, where nothing is left undefined, where nothing remains outside the system. And as this vision takes shape, it begins to reach further, beyond tool, beyond language, toward something more difficult to control, thought. And in the years that follow, this next step will test the limits of how far order can extend. As this movement toward order continued, it did not stop at tools or language. It moved towards something more central, behavior. In a quiet administrative hall, a case is brought forward. Two individuals stand at a distance, their positions fixed, their expressions restrained. An official listens, not to emotion, but to sequence. What happened? When it happened? What result followed? There is no attempt to understand intention beyond its effect. No effort to interpret feeling, because within this system, the law does not ask why, it asks what. And once that is established, the response follows. Clearly, directly, without hesitation. As this pattern repeats, a different relationship between people and authority begins to form. In earlier times, judgment could shift depending on circumstance, on status, on connection. Now, something else takes its place. Consistency. A rule applies, and it continues to apply, across distance, across position, across time. At first, this feels unfamiliar. In a small village, a man speaks carefully to his neighbor, choosing his words not only for meaning, but for consequence, because what is said can now be measured. And what is measured can be recorded. Over time, this awareness settles into daily life. People begin to think ahead, not only about action, but about outcome. A decision is no longer only about what feels right, but about what aligns with the rule. And gradually, behavior begins to adjust. Not dramatically, but consistently. In the fields, work follows a pattern that matches expectation. In the homes, choices reflect awareness of consequence. In the streets, interaction becomes more deliberate, more contained. As this continues, the presence of the law becomes constant, not as something distant, but as something near, something that does not need to be seen to be understood. In a record office, names are written, actions noted, results stored. The system does not forget. And because it does not forget, people begin to remember for it. They anticipate, they align, they adapt. Over time, this creates a different kind of stability. Not one based on trust, but on expectation. A person may not know another's intention, but they understand the consequence of certain actions. And that understanding shapes interaction. In the training grounds, discipline is maintained not through constant force, but through repetition. Movements are corrected, patterns are reinforced, until eventually, behavior follows structure without resistance. As this extends across the state, a larger transformation takes place. The law is no longer something external. It becomes internal, not in belief, but in habit. People begin to act as if the system is always present, because in a sense, it is. And in this lies the strength of the structure. It does not rely on constant enforcement. It relies on consistency, on clarity, on the removal of uncertainty. But as this strength grows, another effect begins to appear, subtle but persistent. Because when every action is guided, there is less space for deviation. When every outcome is defined, there is less room for interpretation. And when every behavior is shaped, the distance between individual choice and system expectation becomes smaller. In the years that follow, this narrowing becomes part of life. Not always noticed, not always resisted, but present. In the way people speak, in the way they decide, in the way they move through each day. And yet, for many, this trade feels acceptable. Because what is gained is something the world has lacked for a long time. Predictability, the sense that actions lead to known outcomes, that effort produces measurable results, that the structure, will not suddenly change. As this understanding settles, the law stands at the center of everything, above custom, above preference, above variation. Not because it replaces all of them entirely, but because it defines how they can exist. And as this continues, the system reaches further still. Because once behavior can be shaped and consistency can be maintained, there remains one final element that does not easily follow rules: the way people think. And in the years that follow, this challenge will begin to take form. As the system continued to extend outward, it did not rely only on roads or laws. It began to move through something quieter: writing. In a dim room lit by a single oil lamp, a scribe sits alone, his brush resting lightly above a narrow strip of bamboo. Before him, several texts are laid out side by side, their characters similar, but not the same. The shapes vary, the strokes differ, the meaning sometimes shifts, just enough to cause hesitation. He studies them in silence. Because across the land, writing already exists, but it does not exist as one. In one region, a character leans slightly to the left. In another, it stands upright. In a third, it is formed with fewer strokes, but carries the same intention. At first, these differences feel manageable. People adapt. They interpret. They learn to read between variations. But as the system grows, this flexibility begins to create a problem. Because a message that changes, even slightly, is no longer certain, and within a structure that depends on clarity, uncertainty cannot remain. In the capital, officials gather around long tables, documents spread before them, brushes moving steadily as they compare form against form, not to preserve difference, but to reduce it. A standard is proposed, not invented entirely, but selected, refined, chosen for its balance, its structure, its ability to be repeated. Over time, this form begins to take precedence. Stroke by stroke, character by character, variation is narrowed. In the script halls, scribes begin to copy only the approved shapes, their hands adjusting slowly, their movements becoming more precise with each repetition. At first, it requires effort. Old habits remain in the hand, in the memory, in the way the brush moves without thought. But with time, those habits begin to fade, and something else replaces them: consistency. In a government office far from the capital, a new document arrives, its characters unfamiliar in form, yet clear in structure. The local official studies it, traces the lines with his eyes, and begins to understand. Because even though the shapes have changed, their meaning does not shift. And in that, there is a new kind of clarity. As this continues, writing begins to move differently across the land. A message sent from the center arrives unchanged at its destination. A record created in one region can be read in another without hesitation. And gradually, communication becomes more direct, less dependent on interpretation, more aligned with intention. In the markets, traders begin to recognize the new forms, seeing them stamped on goods, written on tallies, marked on records of exchange. In the homes, children learn the standardized characters, their hands guided by repetition, their understanding shaped by uniform structure. Over time, this shared system of writing creates something subtle but powerful. A sense that distance has been reduced, not physically, but in meaning. Because when words no longer change, ideas can travel further. As this spreads, the older forms do not disappear immediately. They remain in private texts, in older records, in the habits of those who learned them first. But they begin to lose their place, not erased, but set aside, because within the system only one form is needed, and only one form is maintained. In a quiet archive, stacks of bamboo records rise along the walls, each one marked with the same structured script, each one aligned with the same standard. The room feels still, ordered, complete, and within it, something has changed. Not just how people write, but how they understand connection. Because now, a word carries the same meaning, no matter where it is read. A command holds the same weight, no matter where it arrives. And in that, the system has extended itself into thought. Not by forcing belief, but by shaping expression. As this becomes part of daily life, few pause to consider what has been lost. The variations, the local forms, the subtle differences that once reflected place and identity. They fade quietly, replaced by something more stable, more controlled, more unified. And as this process completes, the written world becomes a reflection of the empire itself. One structure, one form, one direction. And in the years that follow, this alignment will make something else possible. Because when words can be controlled and meaning can be preserved, there remains one final question. What happens to ideas that do not fit? As the written world began to align, another layer of order moved quietly into place. Not through words, but through measure. In a narrow workshop near the center of the capital, a craftsman lifts a metal weight from a wooden table, turning it slowly in his hand, examining its edges, its balance, its shape. Beside him, several others lie in a row, almost identical, yet not exactly the same. The difference is small, barely visible, and yet it matters, because across the land, measurement already exists, but like writing before it, it does not exist as one. A length of cloth in one region may not match the same measure in another. A weight of grain may carry different value, depending on where it is placed on a scale. At first, these variations are accepted. People adjust, they negotiate, they learn to account for difference. But as the system expands, this flexibility begins to slow everything down. A trade must be reconsidered. A calculation must be checked again. An agreement may shift after it is made. And within a structure that depends on consistency, this cannot continue. In the capital, standards are established. Not abstract idea, but physical objects. Weights cast in metal, lengths marked precisely, measures that can be held, compared, repeated. These become the reference. Not suggestions, but definitions. And once defined, they are sent outward. Along the same roads that carry messages and law, these standards begin to travel. In distant regions, local officials receive them with care, placing them in secure spaces, using them to align the tools already in use. At first, the process is slow. A scale is adjusted, a measure is corrected, a discrepancy is noted and resolved. But as this repeats, something begins to change. Transactions become smoother. A trader weighs grain and does not hesitate. A buyer measures cloth and does not question the result. Because now, the measure is no longer local. It is shared. In the markets, coins pass from hand to hand, their shape consistent, their value defined. Round, with a square center, recognizable even at a glance. They do not need to be explained. They are understood. And in that understanding, exchange becomes simpler, not easier in effort, but clearer in outcome. As this continues, the effect spreads beyond trade. Builders use the same lengths, craftsmen follow the same proportions, records reflect the same quantities, no matter where they are written, and gradually, a different experience of the world begins to form. One where distance matters less, because variation has been reduced. In a storage hall filled with grain, sacks are stacked in careful order, each marked, each counted, each measured according to the same standard. The space feels controlled, not rigid, but precise. And within that precision, there is confidence. Because what is stored can be known, what is known can be managed, and what can be managed can be relied upon. As this awareness settles into daily life, people begin to move with greater certainty. A merchant calculates without second guessing. A farmer estimates yield with more accuracy. An official records numbers that will not need to be adjusted later. Over time, this consistency becomes invisible, not because it is unimportant, but because it is expected. It no longer stands out. It simply exists as part of how things work, and in that, the system becomes stronger, not through force, but through alignment. Because when everything is measured the same way, everything can be compared. And when everything can be compared, everything can be organized. As this process completes, the empire begins to feel more connected, not through movement alone, but through agreement. An agreement that does not need to be spoken because it has already been defined. In the capital, the standards remain unchanged, preserved, serving as the origin of all that follows. And across the land, their influence continues, quietly, consistently, until eventually, difference itself becomes difficult to maintain. Because in a world where everything is measured, everything must fit. And as this idea settles, the system prepares for its next extension. Because once the land can be measured and writing can be aligned, there remains something else that still moves freely, movement itself. And in the years that follow, even that will begin to follow a single path. As measures became consistent and writing carried the same meaning across distance, movement itself began to change. Not in speed at first, but in direction. In the early morning, a road stretches outward from the capital, its surface flattened, its edges defined, running straight through fields, hills, and open land. Unlike older paths, which bend and adjust to terrain, this road continues with intention. It does not wander, it connects. At intervals along its length, stations appear. Simple structures at first, wooden frames, fenced enclosures, places where travelers pause, not by choice, but by design. A messenger arrives, his horse breathing steadily, his clothing marked with the authority he carries. He does not stop for long. A fresh mount is prepared, the document in his hand remains sealed, and within moments he continues. Because the message must not slow. Over time, these roads begin to form a network, not random, not isolated, but structured. Each path leading to another, each route calculated, each distance considered. And within this network, something becomes possible. Continuity, a command issued in the capital, can now reach distant regions without delay, without distortion. Not perfectly, but far more reliably than before. As this happens, the experience of distance begins to shift. A place once considered far becomes closer, not in space, but in connection. And with that, control extends. In a provincial office, an official receives a document, its seal unbroken, its contents clear. He reads, understands, and acts. There's no reinterpretation, no adjustment, because the system depends on alignment, the road, the message, the response. All must follow the same line. In the years that follow, movement becomes more than travel. It becomes structure. Caravans still pass, traders still move goods, families still journey between regions. But alongside them, another kind of movement continues. Faster, more direct, more defined, the movement of authority. In the distance, a column advances along the road, its formation steady, its pace unbroken. It is not rushing, it does not need to, because the path has already been prepared. Supplies arrive when expected. Directions are known, stops are planned. And in this, the road does more than connect places. It supports action. Over time, this changes how power is applied. Where once authority weakened with distance, it now holds. Not through presence alone, but through reach. A decision made in one place can be carried outward and enacted without delay. And gradually, this reach becomes normal. In the villages, people begin to understand that distance no longer protects. What happens here can be known elsewhere. What is decided elsewhere can arrive here. Not immediately, but inevitably. As this awareness settles, behavior adjusts once more. Actions are taken with greater care. Choices are made with greater awareness, because the system is no longer confined to a single place. It moves, it travels, it arrives. In a roadside station, a tired traveler sits quietly, watching as officials pass through, their movement uninterrupted, their purpose clear. He does not speak, he only observes, because even without being part of it, he can feel its presence, a structure that extends beyond sight, beyond any single location, and yet touches all of them. As the network continues to grow, its lines stretch further, its connections deepen, and with each addition, the space between center and edge becomes smaller, not in distance, but in difference. Because when movement follows a single pattern, everything it reaches begins to align. And as this alignment strengthens, the system becomes something more than stable. It becomes responsive, capable of acting, not only with force, but with timing. And in the years that follow, this ability to move, to reach, to respond, will make it possible for the empire to shape not just where people live, but how they live within it. As the roads extended and the system reached further into the land, it began to require something more constant. Not ideas, not plans, but effort. In the early hours before sunrise, a line of figures moves slowly along a narrow path, their silhouettes barely visible against the pale light of the sky. Each carries something, a tool, a bundle, a weight that does not need to be explained. They do not speak much. There is no need, because the rhythm of their movement has already been set. Step, pause, step, and over time, this rhythm becomes familiar, not chosen, but repeated. In a clearing at the base of a low hill, work begins. Earth is cut away, stone is lifted, water is redirected through channels that did not exist before. At first, the changes seem small. A trench deepens, a path widens, a structure takes shape. But as days pass and more people arrive, the scale begins to grow. What was once a single task becomes part of something larger, a network of movement, a system of flow, a structure that connects one place to another. And within it, the body becomes central. In the heat of midday, a worker pauses briefly, his hands resting against the handle of a tool worn smooth by use. He looks ahead, not at the full extent of what is being built, but at the next section, because that is all that can be held in view. The next lift, the next step, the next repetition. As this continues, fatigue does not arrive all at once. It settles, gradually, quietly, until it becomes part of the movement itself, a weight carried alongside the task. In the years that follow, these scenes repeat across the land, along riverbanks, across open plains, at the edges of mountains. Groups gather, work begins, and the shape of the land slowly changes. Channels are cut to guide water. Paths are reinforced to carry weight. Barriers are raised where none stood before. Each action, small on its own, but together, forming something that extends beyond any single effort. In a camp set near one of these sites, fires burn low in the evening, their light reflecting off tools laid carefully beside sleeping spaces. The people rest, not fully, but enough to begin again. Because the work does not stop, it continues day after day, moving forward not through urgency, but through persistence. Some have come from nearby regions, others from far beyond. Their paths brought them here, not by choice, but by requirement. Within the system, labor is not only needed, it is assigned. A name appears on a record. A location is given, a task is defined, and the body responds. In a quiet moment, a man adjusts the cloth wrapped around his hands, tightening it slightly, preparing for the next movement. There is no resistance in the gesture, only readiness. Because within this structure, to resist is to disrupt, and disruption carries consequence. So instead, movement continues. Over time, this repetition begins to shape more than the land. It shapes the people themselves. Muscle adapts. Endurance grows. Motion becomes more efficient. Not because the work becomes easier, but because the body learns to meet it. In this way, the system extends beyond instruction. It enters habit, not through force alone, but through continuation. As this happens, the connection between individual and structure becomes clearer. Each person, a part of something larger. Each action, contributing to a form that cannot be seen all at once. A canal that carries water across regions. A road that links distant places. A barrier that defines a boundary. All built through repetition, through effort, through bodies, moving in alignment with a system that does not pause. In the distance, a line of earth rises slowly along the horizon, its shape uneven, but unmistakable. Not complete, but already present, a sign of what is being formed. And as more hands join, more time passes, more effort is applied. That shape becomes clearer, stronger, more defined. But within it, the cost remains. Not always visible, not always recorded, but present. In the quiet pauses between movements, in the stillness of evening, in the weight that lingers even after rest. As the system continues to expand, it draws more from those within it. Not all at once, but steadily. And in doing so, it reveals something essential. That order, on this scale, is not created by idea alone. It is built through the body. And as this truth settles into the land, the system prepares to move further still. because once effort can be directed and movement can be sustained, there remains another step to ensure that nothing within the system can move against it. As the system continued to draw strength from labor and extend itself through roads and records, it turned toward something quieter, but just as decisive: the removal of resistance. In a courtyard within the capital, metal objects are gathered in ordered rows, their surfaces worn, their edges dulled by time or use. Swords, spears, blades once carried by individuals, now placed together without distinction. There's no ceremony, only process. An official steps forward, checking each item against a list, marking what has been received, what has yet to arrive. Because across the land, the same instruction has been given. Weapons are no longer to be held privately, not kept in homes, not carried between regions, not passed from one generation to the next. They are to be collected, centralized, and once gathered, they are to be changed. In a furnace set just beyond the courtyard, fire burns steadily, its heat constant, its purpose clear. Metal is placed within, not destroyed, but transformed. A blade softens, loses its edge, becomes something else. Over time, the objects that once defined personal defense are reshaped into forms that no longer hold the same meaning. Tools, structures, pieces of something larger. As this process continues, its effect moves outward. In distant villages, people gather what they have, not always willingly, but with understanding. Because within the system, refusal is not a private act. It becomes part of a record, and what is recorded leads to consequence. So instead, they comply. A man unwraps a long-kept blade from cloth, its surface marked by years, its presence once tied to protection, to identity, to memory. He holds it for a moment, not in hesitation, but in recognition. Then he places it among others, and the distinction fades. As more are collected, the number of weapons in private hands decreases. Gradually, consistently, until eventually, their absence becomes the norm. In the streets, movement continues, markets open, voices carry across open space, but something has changed. The sense that force may emerge from any direction begins to lessen. Not entirely, but enough to be noticed, because now, the ability to act with violence no longer rests with the individual. It has been moved, shifted from many to one. In the training grounds, soldiers continue their exercises, their weapons precise, their movements controlled. The capacity for force remains, but it is no longer distributed, it is organized. And in that organization, there is control. Over time, this shift begins to influence behavior, not through direct instruction, but through awareness. A disagreement does not escalate in the same way. A conflict pauses long enough to be reconsidered, because the means to act immediately are no longer present. As this awareness settles, the structure becomes more stable. Not only because resistance is reduced, but because the possibility of resistance has been limited. In a small home near the edge of a former border, a family sits together in the evening, their voices low, their movements unhurried. Outside, the road remains open. Movement continues. The system extends as it always has. But within the home, there's a quiet recognition that the world has changed. Not in a single moment, but through many small adjustments, each one narrowing what was once possible. And among them, this change is one of the most complete. because when tools of resistance are removed, resistance itself becomes harder to imagine. As the years pass, this absence becomes familiar. Children grow without learning the weight of a blade. Travelers move without expecting confrontation at every turn, and gradually, the idea of private force fades, replaced by something more distant, more centralized, more controlled. The system no longer needs to respond to scattered resistance, because it has reduced the conditions that allow it to form. And in this, its strength deepens, not through visible power, but through limitation, through the quiet removal of alternatives. As this continues, the structure becomes more complete, but within that completeness, a different question begins to take shape. Because once action is controlled and resistance is reduced, there remains one space that does not follow as easily, the space of thought. And in the years that follow, this final space will begin to draw attention. As resistance became harder to act upon, something else began to change. Not in what people did, but in how they moved through each day. In a narrow street lined with low wooden walls, footsteps pass one another without pause. A merchant adjusts his goods, a passerby nods slightly, and the moment moves on. Nothing feels unusual, and yet something has shifted. The conversations are shorter, the pauses slightly longer, words are chosen with care, not out of fear alone, but out of habit. Because over time, people have learned to consider more than meaning. They consider consequence. In a small gathering near the edge of a marketplace, voices rise briefly, a disagreement forming over a simple exchange. For a moment, the tone sharpens. Then it softens, not because the issue is resolved, but because the direction is understood. There is a point beyond which words no longer remain only words, and so they return to quiet. As this pattern repeats, a different kind of order begins to appear, not imposed in each moment, but carried within it. In the homes, conversations shift. Families speak of daily matters, of work, of movement, of small concerns that remain close to the surface. Larger questions are left unspoken, not forbidden, but unnecessary. Because within the system, certain topics do not lead to action, and over time, what does not lead to action is set aside. In a record hall, officials continue their work, names written, actions noted, outcomes stored. The system does not raise its voice, it does not need to. Its presence is understood. In the distance, along the roads that connect regions, movement continues as before. Messages travel. Orders arrive. Responses follow. Everything aligns. And within that alignment, something becomes less visible. Difference. Not erased entirely, but reduced. Because when behavior follows expectation, variation becomes less frequent. And when variation becomes less frequent, it begins to fade from notice. In a field outside a quiet settlement, workers move in rhythm, their actions steady, their focus contained within the task before them. They do not look beyond what is required, not because they cannot, but because there is little reason to. The system provides direction, and direction removes uncertainty. As this continues, a sense of calm begins to settle. Not the calm of freedom, but the calm of predictability. A day unfolds as expected. A task leads to a known result. A decision follows a clear path. And for many, this is enough. Because uncertainty has long carried its own weight, and its absence, even when replaced by limitation, it can feel like relief. But beneath this surface, another layer exists, quieter still. In the space between words, in the moments before a thought is spoken, in the decision to remain silent, there is awareness, not always defined, not always acknowledged, but present, the understanding that the system extends further than before, not only into action, but into the space that precedes it. In a dimly lit room, a man sits alone, his hands resting still, his thoughts moving, without sound. He does not write them, he does not speak them, he lets them pass. Because within this world, not everything that can be thought needs to become visible. And gradually, this distinction becomes part of life, between what is known and what is expressed, between what exists and what is allowed to take form. As the years pass, this quiet separation deepens. The system continues to function efficiently, consistently, and those within it move in alignment. But within that alignment, something remains, not resistant, not disruptive, just present. A space that has not yet been fully shaped, and as the system reaches its fullest extent, this space becomes more noticeable, because everything else has already been defined. And in the years that follow, attention will turn toward what remains undefined, toward what still exists beyond structure, thought, and what happens when it does not follow the same path. As the system extended into behavior and silence settled into daily life, attention began to turn toward something less visible, the past. In a quiet chamber within the capital, bamboo strips are stacked in careful bundles, their surfaces marked with lines of writing, records of thought, memory, interpretation. Some are recent, others much older, different styles, different voices, different ways of understanding the world. For a long time, these differences existed side by side, not always in agreement, but present. And within a divided world, that presence had been possible. But now, the structure has changed. There is no longer a need to balance many interpretations. There is one system, one direction, and within that, difference begins to take on a new meaning, not as variation, but as inconsistency. In a council hall, a discussion unfolds, not loudly, not with visible tension, but with clarity. What is written shapes how people think. What people think shapes how they act. And if action is to be aligned, then thought must not move too far from the system that defines it. This idea does not arrive suddenly. It forms gradually, through observation, through experience, through the steady expansion of control into every other part of life. And eventually, it becomes direction. In the days that follow, instructions begin to move outward from the center. Not all writings are addressed. Not all records are removed. Only those that do not align. Texts that describe earlier systems. Accounts that present alternative ways of ordering society. Interpretations that place authority elsewhere. They are identified, collected, set apart. In a courtyard beyond the main administrative buildings, a small fire burns, steady, controlled, its light flickering across the edges of bundled bamboo. There is no crowd, no announcement, only a process carried out as part of the system. A bundle is placed near the flame, the outer strips beginning to darken, the edges curling slightly as heat rises. The characters, once clear, begin to blur, not all at once, but slowly. As this happens, there's no attempt to preserve what is written, no effort to debate its meaning. Because within the system, the decision has already been made. Over time, this process repeats. In the capital, in regional centers, in places where records are kept. Not everything is removed. Practical knowledge remains. Agricultural records, technical instruction, but writings that offer different frameworks, different hierarchies, different ideas of authority become less present, and gradually they begin to disappear. In a small household far from the center, a man unwraps a set of bamboo strips, their surface worn, their contents familiar. He reads in silence, not to challenge, but to remember, because what is written here will not be replaced, only removed. He pauses, then returns them to their wrapping, placing them where they will not be easily found. Not out of defiance, but out of awareness. Because within the system, what is visible can be acted upon, and what is hidden remains. For a time, as the years pass, the visible world of writing begins to change. Official texts follow a single form. Records align with a single structure. Messages reflect a single direction. And within that, variation becomes harder to encounter, not impossible, but less common. In the halls of administration, shelves that once held a wider range of texts now reflect a narrower selection, clearer, more consistent, more aligned, and with that, easier to manage. As this continues, the effect extends beyond the written word, because when certain ideas are no longer present, they are no longer repeated. When they are no longer repeated, they are no longer familiar. And over time, what is unfamiliar fades, not erased from existence, but removed from everyday thought. In this way, the system does not need to argue against difference. It reduces its presence, quietly, steadily, until what remains feels complete. As this settles across the land, few moments mark the change. There is no single day when the past disappears. Only a gradual shift in what is seen, what is read, what is remembered. And in that shift, something becomes clear. That control, on this scale, does not always require force. Sometimes it moves through absence, through what is no longer there. As the system continues forward, its structure now reaches further than before. Into action, into behavior, into silence, and now, into memory itself. And in the years that follow, this influence over what is remembered will begin to shape something deeper still. Because once the past is narrowed, the future becomes easier to define. As certain writings faded from view, and the past became less visible in daily life, what remained began to change in meaning. Not because the words themselves had shifted, but because of where they now stood. Within the system. In a quiet archive near the center of the capital. Rows of bamboo records rise along the walls. Each bundle tied, each surface marked with the same structured script, each entry aligned with the same form. The space feels ordered, not simply arranged, but controlled. Because what is kept here is no longer just information. It is selection. Over time, knowledge has not disappeared entirely. It has been gathered, filtered, placed within boundaries. In a small workroom connected to the archive, a scribe copies a document with steady hands, his brush moving in practiced lines, each character formed without hesitation. He does not question the content. He does not compare it with other versions. Because within this system, there is no need to reconcile difference. there is only the form that remains. As this process continues, knowledge begins to move differently across the land. A text is no longer simply something that exists. It is something that has been allowed. In the regional offices, officials receive documents that follow a single structure, their content consistent, their purpose clear. Instructions are understood without variation. Records are interpreted without confusion, and in that there is efficiency. Because when knowledge aligns, action follows more easily. In the markets, traders rely on familiar records in the fields. Farmers follow known practices in the administration. Decisions are made using the same references again and again, and gradually, this repetition begins to shape expectation, not only of what is done, but of what can be known. In a small household, a child learns to read from a set of standard texts, his finger tracing the characters, his voice repeating their sound. He does not encounter alternatives, not because they never existed, but because they are no longer present here. And over time, what is not encountered does not form part of understanding. As this continues, the role of knowledge becomes clearer. It is no longer a space of open interpretation. It becomes a tool, something that supports the system, that reinforces its structure, that aligns thought with action. In the capital, advisors review documents not for diversity, but for consistency. A text that fits the system remains. A text that does not is set aside, and in this, a quiet boundary is maintained, not always visible, but always present, between what is included and what is not. As the years pass, this boundary becomes part of daily life. People read what is available. They think within what is presented. They act based on what is reinforced. Not forced, but guided. In a long corridor within the administrative center, footsteps echo softly. An official carries a set of records from one chamber to another, their contents unchanged, their form familiar. There is no need to question them, because within this structure, consistency is the goal, and consistency has already been achieved. As this awareness settles, knowledge itself begins to feel stable, not shifting, not contested, simply present. And for many, this stability feels like clarity, a world where information does not contradict itself, where meaning does not drift, where understanding does not require constant adjustment. But beneath that clarity, another layer exists, less visible, but just as real. Because when knowledge is defined, it also defines the limits of thought. What can be considered, what can be expressed, what can be imagined. And over time, these limits become familiar, not as restrictions, but as the shape of the world itself. In the quiet moments between tasks, in the spaces where thought moves without sound, few consider what lies beyond those limits. Not because it is impossible, but because it is no longer necessary. As the system continues to function, its reach into knowledge remains steady, not expanding rapidly, not tightening suddenly, but holding, maintaining the balance it has created, and within that balance, the structure becomes more complete. Because action aligns with law. Law aligns with record. Record aligns with knowledge. And knowledge aligns with power. As this connection settles into place, the system approaches a new level of stability. But within that stability, a quiet tension remains. Because even when knowledge is shaped and thought is guided, there are still those who remember differently. And in the years that follow, their presence will begin to matter. As knowledge settled into a single form, and the system held its shape across the land, there remained a quieter presence. Those who remembered differently. In a modest residence near the edge of the capital, a small group gathers in the evening, their voices low, their posture relaxed, yet attentive. Bamboo texts rest between them, not arranged in official order, but handled with familiarity. These are not records of administration, not instructions, not standardized forms. They are older, teachings passed from teacher to student, interpretations shaped over time, ways of understanding the world that existed before the system became complete. The men who study them are not officials in the same sense as those in the court. They do not manage roads. They do not record production. They do not enforce law. They observe. They reflect. They compare what is with what once was. And in that comparison, a difference appears. Not always spoken, not always intended to challenge, but present. Because where the system values consistency, they value meaning. Where the system defines action, they consider intention. Where the system aligns everything toward a single direction, they remember a time when many directions coexisted. At first, this difference exists quietly. It does not interrupt the function of the state. It does not disrupt the movement of authority. It remains within conversation, within teaching, within memory. In the years that follow, some of these scholars are drawn into the administrative structure. Their knowledge is recognized. Their ability to read and interpret becomes useful. They are given positions. They are asked to contribute. And for a time, this connection holds, because the system can incorporate what aligns with it, but not everything aligns. In a discussion within a formal hall, a scholar speaks carefully, his words measured, his tone controlled. He does not oppose directly. He does not reject the system, but he introduces a comparison, a reference to earlier principles, to different ways of organizing authority, to ideas that suggest a structure can take more than one form. The room remains quiet, not in agreement, not in conflict, but in recognition, because even a small variation can be noticed. As this happens, a subtle tension begins to form, not visible in open action, but present in perception. Those who maintain the system begin to observe more closely, not only what is done, but what is suggested, not only what is written, but what is implied. Because within a structure built on alignment, difference, even when quiet, can spread. Over time, this awareness leads to a shift. Not sudden, not dramatic, but clear. Certain discussions are no longer encouraged. Certain comparisons are left unexplored. Not forbidden directly, but set aside. And gradually, the space in which these scholars move becomes narrower. In the gatherings where they once spoke freely, conversations become shorter. References become less frequent. Not because memory has faded, but because expression has changed. In a dim room, one of them sits alone, his hands resting on a set of texts, his thoughts moving without being spoken. He understands the structure around him. He recognizes its strength, its consistency, its reach. And within that understanding, he adjusts, not abandoning what he knows, but choosing when and how it appears. As this continues and the presence of these scholars does not disappear, but it changes from visible voices to quieter ones, from open discussion to internal reflection. And within that shift, something important takes place. Because even when not expressed, thought remains. And even when not shared, memory persists. The system continues to function efficiently, consistently, but alongside it, this quieter layer exists, not opposing, not disrupting, simply present, a reminder that not everything can be fully aligned. As the years pass, this balance holds for a time. But within the structure, the question does not disappear. How much difference can remain within a system that depends on unity? And in the years that follow, this question will begin to move closer to the center. As the system reached into memory, and even quiet thought began to adjust, a different kind of question slowly appeared. Not about what was happening, but about what had already happened. In a dim archive room, a set of records lies open on a low table, their surfaces marked by careful writing, their edges worn by time and handling. An official studies them in silence, his eyes moving from one account to another, noticing something small. A difference, not large enough to disrupt the overall meaning, but present. In one version, an event is described in a certain way. In another, the same event carries a slightly different tone. The outcome remains the same, but the path feels altered. At first, this is not unusual. In earlier times, variation in record was expected. Stories changed as they traveled. Details shifted depending on who told them. But now, within a system built on consistency, even a small difference stands out. As this awareness grows, a subtle process begins. Records are compared, versions are examined. Certain forms begin to take precedence, not because they are proven beyond doubt, but because they align more closely with the structure that now exists. Over time, this alignment becomes the deciding factor. What fits remains visible. What does not becomes less so. In a quiet conversation between two officials, the matter is discussed without urgency. One notes the variation, the other considers its effect. Not whether it is true, but whether it is useful. Because within the system, the purpose of record is not only to remember, it is to support, to maintain clarity, to reinforce structure, to prevent uncertainty from returning. And so, a direction is chosen, not to invent entirely, but to shape. Gently, consistently, until the record reflects a single line. In distant regions, where older accounts still linger, the same process unfolds more slowly. A story told by an elder differs slightly from what is written in official text. The listeners notice, but do not question openly, because over time, they have learned which version carries weight, and gradually, the spoken version begins to fade, not because it is forgotten, but because it is no longer repeated. As this continues, the difference between memory and record begins to narrow. What is written becomes what is known. What is known becomes what is accepted, and in that, certainty appears, not absolute, but stable. In the capital, new records are created, their structure consistent, their narrative aligned with what has been established. They do not contradict, they do not diverge, they follow. And because they follow, they can be trusted within the system. As the years pass, this trust deepens. People read what is presented and understand it as complete, because there is no visible alternative. In a quiet moment, a scholar sits alone, his thoughts moving between what he has read and what he has heard before. He does not attempt to resolve the difference. He allows it to exist without expression. Because within this world, certainty is not always the result of knowing everything. It is the result of having only one version to consider. As this understanding settles, the nature of history itself begins to shift. It is no longer a collection of perspectives, but a single thread drawn through time, clear, continuous, unbroken, and within that thread, complexity becomes less visible, not removed entirely, but smoothed. In this way, the past becomes easier to hold, easier to teach, easier to align with the present, and as this alignment strengthens, the system gains something new. Not only control over action, not only influence over thought, but a quiet authority over memory. As this continues, the question of what truly happened does not disappear. It remains in small differences, in unspoken thoughts, in fragments that do not fully align. But these fragments no longer shape the larger view. They exist at the edges, and the center remains clear. As the system moves forward, this clarity becomes one of its greatest strengths. A past that supports the present, a narrative that does not conflict, and a structure that no longer needs to question itself. But within that certainty, another tension begins to form, because even when the past is aligned and memory is shaped, there are limits to what can be controlled, not in record, not in thought, but in something more immediate, the human response to time itself. And in the years that follow, this response will begin to draw the attention of the one at the center of it all. As the past settled into a single line, and the system held its form across the land, attention turned inward, not to the people, not to the records, but to the one at the center, in the capital, within chambers set behind multiple walls. The movement of daily governance continues as before. Documents arrive. Decisions are recorded. Orders move outward along the roads that carry them. Everything functions. Everything aligns. And yet, within this stability, something begins to shift. Quietly. In the stillness between tasks. In the moments where no instruction is being given, a different kind of awareness emerges. Time. Not measured in records, not defined by calendars, but felt. In the passing of days, in the repetition of routine, in the subtle change that cannot be recorded in the same way as law or decree. For the first time, the system that has brought everything into order does not fully contain what is being noticed, because time moves without instruction. In a dimly lit chamber, the emperor sits alone, his surroundings still, his presence unchallenged. There is no disorder here, no inconsistency. And yet, this does not resolve what is felt, because beyond the reach of the system, there remains something that does not align, the limit of the body. In the years that follow, this awareness does not disappear, it returns, again and again, not as fear in its sharpest form, but as recognition, that even within perfect order, there is an ending. As this realization deepens, a response begins to take shape, not through public decree, but through quiet inquiry. In the outer regions, messengers are sent, their instructions simple, their purpose less so. They are to seek, not land, not resources, but knowledge, of substances, of practices, of methods said to extend life, to preserve it, to move beyond its natural limit. In distant places, individuals are brought forward, their reputations carried through stories, their claims not always verifiable, but not easily dismissed. They speak of balance, of elements, of transformations that occur beyond ordinary perception. In the court, they are received, not with full belief, but with attention, because within a system that has achieved so much, it is not impossible to consider that something more may be found. Over time, these ideas begin to circulate. Elixirs are prepared, substances are tested, rituals are performed, not in public view, but within controlled spaces, where outcome can be observed and recorded. At first, there is no clear result, but the search continues because the question remains. If the land can be unified, if behavior can be shaped, if memory can be aligned, can time also be influenced? In the quiet of evening, as the work of the day concludes, this question does not fade. It lingers, not as something to be resolved immediately, but as something that cannot be ignored. In the years that follow, the effort intensifies. More journeys, more attempts, more attention given to what lies beyond the known. And within this process, a subtle shift occurs. The system, which once extended outward, begins to fold inward, toward the individual, toward the body, toward the limit that cannot be removed through structure alone. In this way, the greatest power in the land encounters its only boundary, not in opposition, not in resistance, but in inevitability. As this understanding settles, it does not weaken the system, but it changes its focus. Because when everything external has been ordered, what remains is internal. And in the years that follow, this inward turn will leave its mark, not only on the present, but on what is built to remain after the end. As the search for permanence continued, and attention turned inward toward the limits of the body, another kind of work began to take shape. Not in open fields, not along roads, but beneath the ground. In a wide expanse beyond the capital, the earth is marked, not by walls or gates, but by quiet boundaries that define a space set apart. At first, the movement is subtle. Small groups arrive, tools are carried, measurements are taken. Nothing rises above the surface. And yet, something is beginning. In the early hours before the full light of day, workers descend into openings carved into the soil, their steps careful, their movements guided by instruction that extends beyond what can be seen. Below, the air changes. Cooler. Still. The space is not yet formed, but it is being shaped. Over time, the scale becomes clearer. Chambers are expanded. Passages are aligned. Surfaces are reinforced. Not as temporary structures, but as something intended to remain. In the distance, carts move steadily, carrying materials that do not return to the surface once delivered. Clay, stone, objects prepared elsewhere, now brought to a place where they will not be used in the same way again. In a large workshop nearby, figures begin to take form, not living, but shaped with care. Each one different, each one detailed. Faces distinct, expressions fixed, postures prepared. They stand in rows as they are completed, not yet arranged, but already part of something larger. Over time, these figures are moved, not displayed, not seen, placed, positioned within the space below, as if awaiting something that has not yet arrived. As this continues, the purpose becomes clearer. This is not a structure for the living. It is a structure for what follows. In the quiet of the chamber, an official reviews the layout, his attention moving from one section to another, ensuring alignment, ensuring completion. Because within the system, even this must follow order. Nothing is left undefined. Even beyond life, the structure remains. In the years that follow, the work does not slow. It continues with the same consistency, the same precision, the same reliance on effort that has shaped everything else. Above ground, life moves forward. Fields are tended, records are kept, the system functions. But below, a different form of continuity is being prepared. One that does not change with time. One that does not require response, only presence. In a quiet moment, a worker pauses within the chamber, his hand resting briefly against a surface that has been shaped over many days. He does not see the whole. He does not need to. Because like everything else, his role is part of a pattern, and the pattern is already defined. As more time passes, the structure approaches completion, not announced, not revealed, simply finished. A space that reflects the world above, ordered, arranged, held within boundaries that do not shift. And within it, the idea of continuation takes form, not through memory alone, not through record, but through replication. A court mirrored, a presence maintained, a system extended beyond the point where life ends. As this understanding settles, something becomes clear, that even as the system encounters its limit, it does not stop, it adapts. It creates a way to remain, even when the body cannot. In the stillness of the chamber, see, courses, nothing moves, and yet everything has been arranged, as if movement might return, as if the structure itself is enough to preserve what once directed it. Above ground, the world continues as before, but below, a different kind of permanence has been constructed, one that does not rely on time, but exists outside of it. And in the years that follow, this quiet presence will stand as a reflection, not only of power, but of its final boundary. As the structure beneath the earth reached its stillness, another line began to rise above it, not hidden, not quiet, but stretching, slowly, across the visible world. In the northern reaches of the land, where the terrain shifts between open plains and uneven ridges, a long formation begins to take shape. At first, it is difficult to see as a whole. Only sections appear, a raised line of earth, a reinforced path along a slope, a barrier where none existed before. But over time, these sections connect, and as they connect, the scale becomes clearer. In the early light of morning, figures move along the ridge, their forms small against the horizon, their movements steady, deliberate. They carry tools, materials, the same weight that has followed them through other works. Only now, the direction is different, not downward, not inward, but outward and along. As this continues, the line extends across hills, across valleys, across distances that cannot be seen from a single point. And within that extension, a boundary is formed, not simply to mark space, but to define it, to separate what is inside from what is not. In a work site along a narrow pass, the ground is packed layer by layer, earth pressed into form, stone added where needed, each section shaped with the same intention. The process is familiar. Repetition, alignment, continuation. But here, there is a difference, because this structure does not carry water. It does not connect regions. It stands, it holds. And in doing so, It represents something else, a response to what lies beyond the system, in the distance, beyond the line being formed. Movement exists that does not follow the same pattern, unpredictable, unaligned, and so a boundary is created, not to eliminate difference, but to contain it. As this work continues, the effort required begins to deepen. The terrain resists, the distance extends, the conditions shift, but the movement does not stop. More people arrive, more time is given, more of the land is shaped, and gradually, the cost becomes more visible. Not as a single moment, but as accumulation. In the pauses between work, in the slower movements, in the weight that does not fully lift even at rest, there's recognition that this line is not formed without consequence. In a quiet moment along the ridge, a worker looks out across the land, his breath steady, his hands still for a brief time. He does not see the full length of what is being built. No one does, only sections, only parts. And yet, the effort continues, as if the whole were always present. As the years pass, this pattern repeats, section by section, layer by layer, until the line stretches far enough that it begins to feel continuous. Not complete, but present. And within that presence, a new kind of meaning forms. The wall is not only a structure, it is a statement that the system has reached its edge, that beyond this point there is something it cannot fully shape, and so it defines the limit. As this understanding settles, a quiet reflection begins to appear, not spoken directly, but felt, because everything that has been built, roads, records, laws, structures beneath the earth, has required effort, and that effort has come from the same source. People, their time, their bodies, their movement, repeated until the form is complete. In the stillness of evening, as the work slows, the line remains, rising against the fading light, its presence steady, its purpose clear, and yet not entirely resolved. Because while it defines a boundary, it also reveals something else, that even a system built on total order must acknowledge what lies beyond it. And in doing so, it shows its limit. As this realization deepens, the cost of that order becomes easier to see, not in a single place, not in a single moment, but across everything that has been required to sustain it. And in the years that follow, this cost will not remain hidden, because what has been built so carefully, so completely, will soon be tested by the one thing it has not yet fully controlled. Change. As the line of the wall stretched across the land, and the system reached what felt like its outer limit, the center began to shift, not outward, but inward. In the capital, the routines of governance continue. Documents arrive, orders are issued, the structure remains intact. Nothing appears to change. And yet, within the movement of each day, there is a subtle adjustment, a slowing, not in action, but in presence. In the years that follow the great works, the emperor does not remain still. He travels, not as a ruler seeking conquest, but as one observing what has already been brought together. Along the roads, his passage is marked by preparation, by alignment, by the quiet readiness of each place he enters. Everything is arranged in advance. Everything functions. And yet, these journeys are not only outward, they carry something else, a continuation of the search for what has not yet been resolved. In distant regions, the same inquiries persist. Substances are gathered, methods are proposed, possibilities are considered, each one a response to the same question. How long can this continue? In a temporary residence set along one of these routes, the emperor rests in a chamber prepared with care, its order matching that of the capital, its stillness complete. Nothing is out of place, and yet something remains unchanged, the passage of time, not visible, not recorded in the same way as law or decree, but present, in the rhythm of breath, in the quiet intervals between thought, in the gradual shift that no structure can fully contain. As this awareness deepens, the search intensifies. More attention is given to what might extend life, more effort placed into what might delay its end. But over time, results do not align with expectation. They do not follow instruction. They do not respond to structure. And within that, a quiet understanding begins to form that this is not something that can be directed. In the stillness of a late evening, within a chamber far from the center, the system remains intact. The records are complete. The roads extend. The laws hold. But the body moves toward its limit. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but as it always has, gradually. And then the movement stops. There is no single moment that defines it. No sound that marks the transition, only a change. The presence that once directed everything no longer does. And in that, a space appears, not visible, but real, because within a system built on a single center, the absence of that center cannot be ignored. At first, the structure continues as before. Decisions are maintained, processes continue. Movement does not immediately change, because the system has been built to function. But beneath that continuity, something has shifted. The point from which everything extended is no longer there. In the records, this moment is noted, carefully, formally, but the full effect does not appear at once. It moves slowly, through awareness, through adjustment, through the recognition that something fundamental has changed. In distant regions, the roads still carry messages, the laws still apply, the structure still holds. But over time, small differences begin to appear, not in what is written, but in how it is carried out. Because without a single presence to define direction, interpretation begins to return, at first barely noticeable, then slightly more, and as this continues, the system begins to encounter something it has not faced in many years: variation. In this way, the end does not arrive as collapse. It begins as a shift, a movement away from perfect alignment toward something less certain. As the years move forward, this shift will grow, not all at once, not in a single place, but across the land in ways both visible and subtle. And in that movement, the structure that once seemed complete will begin to change. Because without the center, the lines that extended from it no longer hold in quite the same way. And in the years that follow, this quiet change will begin to reveal what remains when the system can no longer fully sustain itself. As the presence at the center faded, the system did not stop. It continued. The roads remained open. The records continued to be written. The laws still carried their weight. From a distance, everything appeared unchanged. And yet, within that continuity, something had begun to loosen. In a provincial office far from the capital, an official reads a decree, its wording clear, its structure familiar. He understands what is written, but for a brief moment he pauses. Not because the instruction is unclear, but because something else is missing: the certainty of where it comes from. In earlier years, direction did not require reflection. It moved outward from a single point, and in that movement, it remained consistent. Now, the movement continues, but the point is no longer the same, and in that, a small space appears, a space for interpretation. At first, this space is barely used. Decisions follow established patterns. Processes remain aligned, because the system has been built to hold. But over time, the absence at the center begins to spread, not physically, but through awareness. In a remote settlement, a message arrives later than expected, its seal intact, its content unchanged. The delay is small, almost unimportant, and yet it is noticed, because within a system that once moved with precision, even a slight difference stands out. As this happens again and again, the pattern shifts. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually. In the markets, traders begin to rely slightly more on local understanding, adjusting exchanges not by standard alone, but by circumstance. In the fields, decisions are made with a bit more flexibility, based on conditions, rather than strict expectation. These changes are small. Individually, they do not alter the system, but together, they begin to form a different rhythm. In the corridors of administration, communication becomes less direct, not unclear, but less immediate. A message is interpreted, a response is adjusted, a decision carries a trace of the person who delivers it, and over time, this trace becomes more visible. Because without a single point of alignment, variation returns, not as chaos, but as difference. In a quiet room, an official compares two records, their contents nearly identical, their wording slightly changed. He notices, but he does not correct it immediately, because within the current structure, there is no longer a single force that demands exact uniformity. As the years pass, this shift deepens, not in the form of open resistance, but in the quiet reappearance of individual decision. Choices made, not entirely against the system, but not fully defined by it either. In this way, the structure begins to change from within, not broken, but adjusted, not removed, but softened. In the distance, along the long lines of road, movement continues. Messengers still travel. Orders still arrive. But their effect is no longer identical everywhere. And in that, the idea of a single, unbroken system begins to fade, replaced by something more complex, a structure that still exists, but no longer holds with the same precision. As this awareness spreads, a different kind of tension begins to form, not between opposing forces, but between what remains and what is changing. Because the system has not disappeared. It is still present, still functioning, but no longer complete. And in that incompleteness, something new begins to appear, not yet visible, not yet defined, but forming. As the years continue, this quiet shift will not remain contained, because once variation returns, it does not stop. It expands. And in the years that follow, these first cracks will begin to widen. As the first cracks widened, they did not remain hidden within records or quiet decisions. They began to appear in the open, in a distant region, far from the capital. Rain falls longer than expected. The ground softens. Fields that once held steady begin to give way. At first, the change is small. Water gathers where it should not. Paths become harder to cross. movement slows. But as the days continue, the effect deepens. Harvests are delayed, supplies become uncertain, and within that uncertainty, something begins to shift. In earlier times, such changes would be local, contained, managed within the rhythms of each place. But now, within a system that depends on alignment, disruption travels. A delay in one region affects another. A shortage here echoes elsewhere, and gradually, the pattern of consistency begins to break. In a small village, a group gathers near a storage area, their voices low, their expressions measured. They are not discussing theory, not comparing systems. They are considering something simpler. What remains when expectation is no longer met? In the years that follow, these moments become more frequent. Not everywhere at once, but enough to be noticed. A task that cannot be completed, a demand that cannot be fulfilled, a response that arrives too late, and within each of these a decision is made. At first, that decision is to wait, to adjust, to endure, because that is what the system has taught. But over time, as the pattern repeats, waiting becomes something else. A limit. In one region, a small group fails to meet a requirement, their situation recorded, their outcome expected. But this time, the response does not follow the same path. They do not align, they do not correct, they stop. It is not loud, not immediate, but it is different. And difference, once returned, begins to spread. In nearby areas, others observe, not with urgency, but with awareness. Because within a system that has shaped behavior so completely, even a small deviation can carry meaning. In the distance, along roads that once moved without interruption, travel slows. Messages take longer. Responses become uneven. And with each delay, the sense of a single direction begins to weaken. In a quiet moment, an official stands beside a record, his hand resting on its surface, his eyes fixed not on what is written, but on what is no longer certain. Because for the first time, the system encounters something it cannot immediately absorb. Not resistance in its traditional form, but absence of compliance. As this continues, the structure does not collapse, it shifts. Pressure builds, not in one place, but across many. And gradually, those pressures begin to connect. In scattered regions, small groups act, not in coordination, but in similarity. A refusal here, a delay there, a choice made outside the expected pattern. Individually, they remain limited, but together, they form something else. A movement, not defined by a single leader, not shaped by a single idea, but by a shared condition. That the system no longer holds in the same way. As this awareness spreads, the lines that once connected everything begin to carry something different. Not only command, but uncertainty, and in that uncertainty, the balance shifts. In this way, the change does not arrive as a single event. It unfolds, gradually, quietly, but unmistakably. Because once the ground beneath the system begins to move, even slightly, everything built upon it must respond. And in the years that follow, this movement will not return to stillness. It will continue until the structure itself can no longer remain unchanged. As I reflect on this moment, there is something almost imperceptible in how it unfolds. The system does not fail because it is weak. In many ways, it is strong, precise, and complete. But strength, when extended too far, can begin to lose its balance. There is something quiet in the idea that a structure designed to remove uncertainty can itself become vulnerable when it leaves no space for it. Because uncertainty isn't always disorder, sometimes it is flexibility, the ability to adjust, to absorb change, to allow variation without breaking. And when that flexibility is reduced, even a small disruption can travel further than expected. It becomes clear that no system, no matter how complete, can remain unchanged indefinitely. Not because it lacks control, but because it exists within time. And time moves in ways that cannot be fully directed. So, what remains is not the perfection of the system itself, but the way it responds when that perfection can no longer be maintained. And in that response, we begin to see not only how things end, but what they were built upon from the very beginning. As the ground continued to shift and the structure no longer held in perfect alignment, the change did not arrive as a single moment. It spread across distance, across time, across the quiet spaces where certainty once existed. In the capital, the halls remained standing, their columns unchanged, their surfaces still reflecting the order that shaped them. Records continue to be written, names continue to be recorded, but the meaning begins to soften. Not because the system has disappeared, but because it no longer defines everything. In distant regions, the movement follows different rhythms. Some places remain close to the structure. Others begin to move away from it. Not in open separation, but in subtle variation. A decision made differently, a rule applied with adjustment, a response shaped by local need, and over time, these differences begin to form patterns of their own. In a quiet village, a family gathers in the evening, their voices low, their conversation unhurried. They speak of the day, of work completed, of small concerns that remain close to the surface. But beneath that, there is something else, a sense that the world is no longer as fixed as it once seemed. Not unstable, not chaotic, but open, in a way that has not been felt for a long time. As this awareness spreads, the system that once defined every movement begins to take on a different role. It remains as memory, as structure, as something that shaped what now exists, but it is no longer absolute. In the fields, work continues. In the roads, movement persists. In the records, names are still written. But each of these now carries a trace of something else. Choice. Not complete freedom, not absence of structure, but a space between what is required and what is possible. And within that space, life begins to move differently. In the capital, the presence that once defined everything is now part of what is remembered. Not visible, not directing, but present, in the shape of the system that remains. In the quiet of an archive, an old record rests among many others, its surface marked by time, its contents aligned with a moment that has already passed. It does not change, it does not respond, it simply remains. And in that, it becomes something else, not instruction, not authority, but reflection. As the years continue, new patterns emerge, not identical to what came before, not entirely separate, but influenced, shaped by what was built and adjusted by what has changed. In this way, the system does not vanish. It dissolves, gradually, quietly, becoming part of the foundation rather than the force above it. And within that transformation, something important becomes clear, that what remains is not the structure in its original form, but the imprint it leaves behind, in the way people organize, in the way they measure, in the way they understand connection, across distance, across time. As I reflect on this, there is something almost still in the realization that even the most complete system does not continue unchanged. It settles. It becomes part of what follows, not as control, but as influence. And perhaps that is what remains most clearly. Not the order itself, but the pattern it creates. A way of seeing, a way of shaping, that continues, even after the structure that formed it has faded. As the land moves forward, and new forms begin to take shape, this quiet inheritance remains, not always visible, not always acknowledged, but present, in the spaces between what was and what is becoming. And in that presence, the story does not end. It changes, gently, almost imperceptibly, into something that no longer needs to hold everything in place, but allows it to move. As the movement of change settled across the land, and the structure that once held everything in place began to soften into memory, what remained was not silence, but something quieter. In the early hours of morning, light spread slowly across the fields, touching the surface of the earth, revealing shapes that have long been there, roads, paths, lines that connect one place to another. Some still used, some fading, and yet all part of what came before. There is no urgency now, no command moving outward, no system pressing toward completion, only continuation. In a small village, a figure steps outside, the air cool, the world still. He does not think of systems. He does not measure the structure of the past. He simply moves into the day that unfolds. And in that movement, something becomes clear, that what once defined everything is no longer required to do so. It has settled in the patterns of thought, in the habits of action, in the quiet ways people understand the world around them. As time continues, the memory of what was built does not disappear. It remains not as force, but as foundation, a way of organizing, a way of connecting, a way of seeing that continues without needing to be enforced. In the distance, the long line of the wall rests against the landscape, unchanged, unmoving, no longer rising, no longer expanding, simply there. And beneath the ground, the silent chambers remain, holding their stillness without expectation. The emperor, the system, the structure that once extended into every part of life, all of it has passed into something else, not gone, but no longer active. And in that transition, there's a kind of balance between what was created and what is allowed to change. As I reflect on this, there is something deeply calm in the realization that even the most complete systems, those that reach into every detail, every action, every thought, do not need to last forever, to matter. They shape, they influence, they leave behind patterns that continue in quieter forms, and perhaps that is enough. Because what endures is not the control, not the structure in its full intensity, but the trace it leaves in how people move, how they decide, how they understand the world, long after the system itself has softened. In the fading light of evening, as the day comes to rest, the land remains, not fixed, not fully defined, but open. And within that openness, there is space for change, for variation, for movement that does not need to follow a single path. the story, which once moved with direction, with purpose, with a sense of completion, now moves differently. It drifts, gently, without urgency, without need to arrive anywhere. And as it does, the details begin to soften, the edges less defined, the structure less present, until what remains is not the system, not the power, not the weight of what was built, but something quieter, a sense of having passed through something vast, and now moving beyond it. And as you listen, there's nothing more you need to follow. No direction to hold, no structure to remember. Only the steady rhythm of breath, of stillness, of time, moving gently forward, until even that begins to fade.